long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a great adventure took place.
Talking Bird, the special edition.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Bird, the special edition. Episode 18. We're 18, and we don't know what we want. I don't know that lyric very well.
It's pretty close. Whatever you said is pretty close to being true.
Yeah, I am your host, Robert Zachary, along with my co-host, John Llewellyn. Hello, John.
Hi. We're 18, and we're not sure who we are.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes, the Talking Bird, the special edition, is now old enough to vote.
Oh.
And to drive a car. Jeez. I guess depending on what state you live in, it was old enough to drive a car a couple weeks ago.
And also, we have to...
And to fight and die at our nation's military.
I was going to say, we have to sign up for selective service now.
Yeah.
Was there a war going on when you had to sign up for selective service?
The Gulf War, I think.
Well, you mean talking about
the first one? The first one.
No, that wasn't going on when you were 18. That was going on.
Oh no, that was when I was 8.
I was 18 when that's done.
No, there wasn't.
So you don't know, man. You don't know what it's like.
No, the Y2K bug was pretty scary, though.
Yes, but that would have.
It was a dark time for us all.
I remember because it's like there was this. I don't know if it probably still happens now when you're a guy, and it might happen for girls too. Actually, it does happen for girls. I don't know why I said that because there's a test that you take, like an assessment test.
It happens for girls too, Robert.
That's what I'm saying. I used to get the call. We used to get the call for like the recruiter finds out who goes to the high school and finds out all the senior boys and starts calling them, cold calling them. And my dad used to like laugh. And he'd always like pass off because he was in the army, but he was in the army in the 50s and he loved it. And he also knows, but he also knew his son was a candy ass and he probably couldn't handle military. And he was all right with that, but he would also like gleefully hand the phone over to me and he would go, "Oh, it's Staff Sergeant Barnes is looking for you." And Staff Sergeant Barnes is Tom Berenger's character in Platoon.
Right.
And it's just like, and they would always like, "Hey, Robert, how's it going? You ever think about serving your country?" And I'm like,
yeah.
If you'd seen me with my, my Metallica shirt and my hair down to my butt and,
They shave that right off first thing. They don't worry about that.
We can't wait, man. Can't wait to shave that head of yours. But there's a test that like an assessment test they can take for military service. Well, my wife now, but at the time she took that test and she actually probably got more calls to join the military than I did.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, because she tests really well. She's way smarter than I am. But, she doesn't have...
And that was a time when the military still cared about things like that.
Yeah, cared about that. It's like, hey, come and get, come to the military and get sexually assaulted and we'll cover it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway... We moved from real war
to Star Wars.
Star Wars. Sorry for the darkness. There's we got a lot of material. We've done a lot of reading. I think I've done a lot of reading. I've done some video game playing.
Yeah, there hasn't been a ton of news in the past week, but some stuff has come out. There's been a little bit of news, some stuff has come out. Some things to consume, to engage in, some content, if you will, and so we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have this on the notes, but the one that keeps getting hammered on me that really is starting to the point where it kind of bugs me is the idea that Mark Hamill almost fell off a mountain.
Oh, I know.
I'm like, really? You make that guy climb a mountain? I mean, I know he's not. He's not.
I thought that's what stunt doubles were for.
Exactly. It's like that can happen in a second. You know, what is that? Michael Skelling Mountain or something like that.
Yeah.
In Ireland, like which that. I didn't make it there at the time, but it looks very precarious at best. And you're taking a 62-year-old
wet, slippery rocks everywhere
actor, and like, hey, why don't you put on this cloak? Because like we all know if he's wearing a Jedi cloak or whatever, it's those things aren't made to. Those are only made to look good on.
I can't imagine whatever like Jedi Uggs he wears or whatever have the best traction either.
They've got that synthetic wool in there, so if he's wearing a synthetic sock, the synthetic wool against it just slides around. Yeah. It's like, oh man. Obviously, they're not Disney's not banking on the future of Mark Hamill.
Yeah, no.
It's like they're basically trying to slowly kill off all the legacy players. It's literally like that old movie from the early 80s, which was actually or late 70s, which was directed by Richard Marquand, called The Legacy, with like Sam Elliott and Catherine Ross, where basically people are in this house and they're slowly killed off.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm going a little deep for that. But yeah, it's like, well, let's see if we can chop Harrison Ford's leg off, kill him by making him fly an antique airship, and then like have Luke fall off. We'll try to get Carrie Fisher back on the drugs.
Yeah. Look, Ryan, we're not saying anything drastic has to happen, but we're very excited about the future of Star Wars being in the hands of John Boyega and Daisy Ridley. That's all we're saying. We're very excited about the future being in their hands.
Now, if Daisy Ridley just happens to slip Anthony Daniels some bath salts, hey, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, there's some like clear film of some kind of drug on the inside of the costume that just seeps into his pores gradually.
Actually,
it's like is it Count of Monte Cristo? Is it Count of Monte Cristo with the arsenic paper or something?
Yeah, something like that. You know, I think we just wrote episode 2 of the Lando Mysteries.
Yeah,
it's like. No, I'm sorry. It'll be like the third season when they start getting experimental and they pull back the fourth wall. So for that episode, it's actually played by Billy D. Williams trying to solve the murder of his co-actors. Anthony Daniels like what do we have here? I think we got some arsenic inside this helmet. Jum jum.
Yeah. Season 5. He runs a hotel for some reason.
oh man, yeah, I'm kind of thinking I might give up all these new prequels, all the comic books, all the mysteries to be revealed, just to actually have the Lando Mysteries.
The Lando, like what's bad about the Lando Mysteries? There is nothing about the Lando Mysteries that's a bad idea.
I know, yeah.
God, I want to make them so badly. And someone let me make the Lando Mysteries.
I wonder if, like, somehow around Christmas, somebody on SNL will do a Lando Mysteries. They'll steal the idea from us.
Ooh, they would. They would.
Hey, man, we're only like 8 degrees of separation from some of American comedy's top performers and writers. You never know where those chains are going to go.
Yes.
But I think we copyright it right now. These characters we don't own. I'm copyrighting it.
I will download a copy of this podcast
and mail it to
record it to cassette tape, put it in an envelope, and mail it to myself.
Exactly. The old and that has worked so many times.
Yeah.
No.
What if people just show up with like a sealed envelope and they're like, I have this copy right here. And they're like, well, how do we know it's in there? And they're like, well, I can't open it because then I lose the copyright. So
that's why
this sealed envelope, and you're going to have to trust me.
That's why when you go to places, you still see people selling those wax seal impression things.
Yeah.
But I'd actually be kind of terrified to get a letter from somebody with a wax seal on it.
Now I think I kind of want a wax seal that has Cloud City on it. Wouldn't that be a nice wax seal?
Well,
just the impression of Cloud City
from the desk of Lando Calrissian.
Yeah. That's in the Lando Mysteries.
He's just like this.
The episode of the Lando Mysteries ends with him like writing in his journal, and then he just like puts that little seal at the bottom of it.
But the first episode, he'd be like, "I have a desk," and then Lobot's like, "Yes, under all those newspapers, all those requisition forms for Tabana gas that you never look at." Yeah. That's what I feel bad about. And when I did my Lando Mystery picture, I didn't put Lobot in there. It was a total oversight on my part.
That's all right.
It's like that, and I haven't been keeping up with the Lando comics after all the praise I had for that first issue.
Has there been another Lando comic since we last talked about it?
I thought you said
I can't remember how many episodes. I think there are 3 issues out.
Okay, so I haven't read anything past the first. Well, you kind of were soft on it, and I was like, it kind of killed my enthusiasm.
The second one's kind of slow. Like, not much happens.
I mean...
then... Or maybe it's the third one that not much happens. Like, it all feels like every episode, every issue of Lando feels like it's a transition where, like, something just happened, and now we have to set up the next thing that happens. But, like, the thing that happens, they spend, like, half a page on. So it never feels like anything big actually happens. They're just waiting for the next thing to happen.
It's the hurry up and wait syndrome, which seems to be quite prevalent in the... Do they call...
those short, like, 4 or 5 issue series, yeah.
I mean, I would honestly say that that's kind of... the modus operandi of the EU, which is it even called the EU anymore? Is it just called the Star Wars universe?
No, I think now like people just say EU to be interchangeable with the legacy stuff. And now when they're talking about like the new canon things, they just refer to them as like the new canon.
Oh, okay.
Or the new timeline or something like that.
Oh, it's so confusing.
You know?
So confusing.
Speaking of which, Shattered Empire #1 came out in the last week.
Mm-hmm.
And so we both had a chance to peruse its pages, or digital pages, I guess.
Yes.
What did you think?
I thought it was all right. I mean, it's definitely the start of something.
Yeah.
I like that. I mean, it's, you know, when I think Star Wars, which is I'll bring this up again when we get into some other stuff. It's like I want to see those characters. I want to see the people that the whole reason I like Star Wars in the first place. So if Han is in there, it's good. I mean, I will knock it a little bit. I mean, I know they're trying to tell a new story, and with with what we assume is Poe Dameron's parents.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that cat's been let out of the bag. If that's news to anyone listening, as soon as the issue came out, everyone was like, "Oh, it's Poe Dameron's parents." Poe Dameron being in Force Awakens, and then Shattered Empire is about this married couple, the father or the man, the husband of whom his last name is Dameron. So
right.
We're assuming these are his parents.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that logic would dictate that, but I mean, Oscar Isaac, even in interviews when they ask him about the character, I think he intimated that like this is a guy who was raised in it, and I think I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I think he said something like, "Oh, you know, he would have been a little kid at the at the medal ceremony on Yavin," which I don't know if maybe he doesn't know how they were going to do the biography of his character or whatever, but he at least knew enough to know that this is something that he is being in the the Alliance of the Rebellion or the whatever it is called now. Mm-hmm. That's like something he was completely raised in, and that I assume that informed his character or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's without I should actually have the comic open so I could refer to it, but
yeah, it's all right.
It's the art style is a little strange. It just seems kind of like, jeez. See, that's the problem with digital comics. You can't just like get to where you need to be. But
I like the artwork overall. It seemed more reminiscent to me of the Vader title than some of the other sort of, short, I guess, anthology series like Lando or Leia or Chewbacca or anything.
Maybe it's not so much the art style is bad. It's just the way this Shara Bay, I guess, is what would be his.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they have like her hair like stuck to her face in every shot.
Yeah,
it's a little bit like overly. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're trying to differentiate her from Leia a little bit.
Yeah, could be. They're both brunettes.
I don't know.
And yeah, I mean the artwork is definitely, it's pretty dense. Like the panels are pretty packed with visual stuff. Either because the close-ups on someone's face are really close, or just because they're packing a lot of action into the frames.
I think they did a pretty good rendering of Han, which I know that he can be a little problematic.
Yeah.
In some stuff. I mean, he looks about 10 years younger in this comic than he did in Return of the Jedi, but that's fine.
Yeah.
And also...
Yeah. He also doesn't look like Bill Maher, though.
Yeah, so that's always a step. But I mean, getting that whole, post-destruction of the Death Star, I mean, that's some great space battles in this too. So and she's flying an A-wing, which is that's a great Star Wars ship that showed up in Return of the. Did it show up in Return of the Jedi, or did it show up at the end of Empire?
Return of the Jedi.
Yeah. But
it's been interesting to me that for the Force Awakens, right? They've updated the X-wing, and so we're getting not quite inundated, but we're getting all of these images and toys and whatever of X-wings, and Poe Dameron's black and orange X-wing and everything.
That's for stealth. Did you read on the thing? It said that's for his stealth missions.
Well, I guess. I mean, that's what they do with airplanes. If you want to make it stealth, you paint it black.
True.
So Force Awakens has really been emphasizing like, oh, look what we've done with the X-wings, whereas pretty much every other Star Wars property that's out there right now has been doing more to show A-wings and B-wings and Y-wings to a lesser extent, but you're not getting X-wings like all over the place. You're getting a wider variety. So like Rebels season 2, they already had a squadron of A-wings in the pilot, or not the pilot, in the season 2 premiere, and then I think B-wings are going to show up later. Aftermath, Star Wars Aftermath, which we'll talk about later, has some A-wings in it. There's the short story Blade Squadron that showed up in like Star Wars Insider or something, and that's about a B-wing squadron that flew in the Battle of Endor. And then just today I saw a preview for Chewbacca #1, and that has an A-wing in it too. So it's interesting to see sort of it's not really emphasizing, but just sort of this subconscious, like what signposts the different things are using to say like, hey, Star Wars is back. And, for the movies, they're using the X-wing, which makes sense because that's sort of the most recognizable kind of ship that they have.
Right.
Like if The Force Awakens came out, it was like, oh, look, we updated the B-wings. I'm sure the casual fan who, saw the original trilogy and, liked it but hasn't kept up with it since, like they're going to be like, what? Why do I care about the B-wing? That thing looks weird. But, the other stuff that maybe, the fans who are really into Star Wars, and they're going to, read the novels or the short stories on Star Wars Insider, or they're going to read the comics or watch Rebels. Like those are the people that they're saying, hey, look what we're doing. We're giving you more A-wings. We're giving you more B-wings. And that's kind of interesting to me how they're sort of setting that out.
Yeah. It's almost like it's like the deeper you go, the more you're rewarded with stuff you're going to recognize. But when they're doing the movies, I mean, as far as I think, in all the production or trailers, I don't think they show any Rebel ship other than the X-wing.
Yeah, they certainly don't show the B-wings.
Right. There's no Y-wing, which is, if we think about the first A New Hope, it's, the X-wing was the ship, but there was also Y-wings in the
right.
battle.
And the Y-Wings were the original, like, they were their bombers.
Right.
And the X-Wings were basically just running interference so that the Y-Wings could blow up the Death Star. And so in Aftermath, the main character is a Y-Wing pilot. But other than that, and I guess one of the toys that came out recently is like Kanan from Rebels with a Y-Wing bomber. So maybe those will show up in season 2, or maybe they just gave him a ship. I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, it's the Y-Wings were sort of, you would think, potentially just as iconic as these X-Wings, but I guess because Luke flew an X-Wing and all of Luke's friends seemed to fly X-Wings, and then the X-Wing pilot showed up in the snow speeders and everything, that the X-Wings became sort of like one of the three, the X-Wings, the TIE fighters, and the Star Destroyers are like the ships that visually like identify Star Wars for people. And so in that sense, it makes sense if they're kind of not rebooting this thing, but trying to re-energize this thing and get more people into this stuff or back into this stuff. They're going to say, hey, remember the original trilogy and how cool the X-Wings were? Well, now their wings open slightly differently. Whereas you can't really do that with like an A-Wing.
Right. They don't have anything that's like cool and movable.
Hey, remember that ship? Remember that ship that flew into the bridge of the Super Star Destroyer in Return of the Jedi?
They're like,
well, now they're
no,
back
I
in
don't.
orange.
No, I don't.
Exactly.
I will say this as a digression, that I would consider the Y-Wing toy to be superior to the X-Wing, although the wings didn't open, obviously, but it could fit. I think it could fit 2 characters in it. And you could put a
two-seated ship, and
you could put your own R2D2 or your R5D4 in the back, and it had a proper 3 landing gear. You didn't have to. I had one of those. I think I still have one of those. But
yeah. Another reason I think that they make kind of superior toys, not even for like putting figures in, but I mean, because the laser cannons on the X-Wing are so thin, both in the movie, but then when they render that as a toy and then they stick them in a plastic package, those things bend really easily. Yeah. And so wandering around the toy stores, I've seen a bunch of, tiny, little, X-Wing, the Black Series X-Wings or whatever, where, the guns are kind of like bent slightly at the end. And like, if you're a collector, or even if you're a kid, who would want like a ship with like bent guns? So whereas the Y-Wing and the A-Wing in particular are much more solid, and you can, they're not going to like bend and become ruined. Well, ruined's too strong a word, but they're not going to bend as easily.
Yeah. And also, I think Luke, he used to fly a Y-Wing a lot in the comics, but he also flew it in the holiday special.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They used a Y-Wing.
Yeah, which it hit the water and kind of skimmed. So yeah, it's interesting.
They tried to make Y-Wings happen, and it just didn't.
I will say, because there wasn't a lot of ships, there was only really 2 varieties. In A New Hope, maybe they're trying to do that kind of that Star Wars ring theory, where they don't want to inundate you with new designs so much. Which
that could be.
Maybe the time they get to the Rian Johnsons, they'll have designed some new ships.
That could be, and especially by maybe by episode 9, because you're right. From
scratch, or they're going to update the B wings and the A wings and the Y wings. Yeah, there's only 4 or whatever.
I mean, I like the X-Wing as much as the next person, but like when I saw Return of the Jedi for the first time, like there's something about both the A-Wing and the B-Wing designs. It just like I was drawn to those designs, and I don't know if it's because like they're weird shapes or whatever, or just because they were different than the X-Wings and the Y-Wings. I think another big piece of this for like our generation, and I don't know that people younger than us will care about this as much, but I do also have like a lot of my impressions of these things are based on playing the X-Wing, the original X-Wing video game on the computer, and you get to fly like all these different things. So just my impressions of like what it was like to fly them. So like I like the design of the B-Wing a lot, but I'm always like, yeah, B-Wings are okay, and it's because for me playing that game, like they were always a little more ungainly, and like the lasers came from weird angles, and so it was hard to. Whereas the X-Wing, or I love the A-Wing because it was fast and you could get in there and shoot stuff quick. and the Y-wings were a little slow and heavier, and it was easier for you to get shot at. So there's something about that experience of playing that game that still, when I think about those ships, like I think about that as much as I do the movies in which I first saw them.
Yeah, why they haven't announced some kind of update for that game is just beyond me.
Yeah,
it's kind of like people are screaming for it, even if it was just a PC release for the hardcore. Because I mean, that was always considered a X-wing and TIE Fighter. Those were always considered like the hardcore PC gamer things because it just wouldn't work on a console with the simplified controls. And then we've already heard some grumblings from some of the beta testers for the new Star Wars game that the whole spaceship combat seems very tacked on, and it's not.
This is for not Uprising. What's the other one? Battlefront, you mean?
Yeah, it's been kind of...
and also like really hard. Like it's really disorienting.
Yeah, I don't think that the company that makes that dice, I don't think that's really their forte, because they added something like that. Their games of Battlefield have always had this thing where it's like, there's always a plane or two that you can steal, or a helicopter, and they've always been notoriously hard to control, and it's like you have to have a certain mindset to do it, which will happen like you'll get a helicopter and like 5 guys will jump in on your thing because they think, oh, it's great, we're gonna fly over the enemies and strafe their base, but you just got in because you thought, oh, the helicopter spawned, and then you take it straight up and it comes crashing back down, and then you get a bunch of angry emails in your Xbox from guys like, you suck, don't take that thing if you don't know how to use it. So for the next game, they kind of did a thing where they had an aerial combat thing and they split it off, where it's like, if you don't like that, you can just avoid it altogether. You don't need to it's not even something you need to win the game.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but especially, I guess we might talk about Uprising later, but if they're going to create sort of an older style, I guess it's called a dungeon crawler, something like more of a kind of a retro style game for Star Wars, like Uprising, you would think they might do something similar for, they would update the X-Wing game for the new X-Wings and Force Awakens, and they have the new, First Order TIE Fighters or whatever. Maybe those will come closer between the first and second movies, where, now once people are familiar with the new ships and the fighters and everything that they can do,
right.
But yeah, it seems like there's a lot of room for them to go back to that kind of a game and offer that to both the people like in our generation who played those, but then also younger people who you can get you can play a lot of those games online now. The versions of those games, and people who have enjoyed doing that too. There's room for that.
Yes. Yeah, I guess maybe.
So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I guess those games do kind of cater to very kind of mercurial type game players who are they get very into it, and that's probably not the first thing that they think of when they're marketing stuff. It's probably more stuff like Uprising and.
Right.
So
we've strayed a bit from talking about Shattered Empire.
Yes, we did. Sorry,
but I will say, I like it a lot, and I like sort of what they're doing, and I'll talk about this more when we get to Aftermath too, but I kind of like the way that they're building up this new story, this new version of what happened after Return of the Jedi. And it's I don't always think the execution hasn't been up to the ideas that they're trying to put out, but like the ideas of where they're taking this story, I think I sort of see where they're going, and I'm intrigued and sort of like, okay, I'm willing to let this play out, and I'm kind of interested to see where this goes. My biggest complaint though about Shattered Empire is that it's only going to be 4 issues, and so the story, like you said, I keep calling them episodes. Issue 1, Shattered Empire issue 1 is very much the beginning, but they don't have a lot of room to like build this story into something huge because they only have 3 more issues left. Whereas something like Uprising, this video game, has the potential to be a bigger story or have a bigger influence on this canon in between the Battle of Endor and then the Force Awakens, because as they've said and we've talked about, right, they're going to let, whatever the users do with this game, like that's going to drive where the canon goes. And it just seems like a missed opportunity. And I understand that, they're jumping on this video games thing and that this is the future of storytelling, or at least I'll say they think it's the future of storytelling, but I also think it's that they like to think it's the future of storytelling because then it makes them sound smarter for getting out ahead of this.
Yeah.
But, I think I wish that Shattered Empire would just sort of run either indefinitely, or you could turn it again into this kind of almost anthology series where, okay, this story of Shara Bey and Kes Dameron takes up 4 to 6 to 8 issues, and then after that you jump over to another story that takes place sort of in roughly the same period of time or later, right afterwards or something, and you focus on a different set of characters, and then maybe in there you see what Lando gets up to, and in there you see what Leia gets up to. You can focus on sort of the big name characters, but then also build up some of these they're not lower level characters, but they're these new characters that they're creating to build up to the Force Awakens story.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of them trying to play this all so close to the vest until they get the movie out and they see how people react to it. I feel like at first I thought like, oh, they've got something really great in the pipeline that they're really sitting on. But I almost think a little bit of it is, well, let's see how the movie plays, and then we'll course correct as needed. If people go like, people go out and go, hey, the new characters were so great that I almost felt like I didn't like Luke.
I want to see their origin story. I want to see who their parents are.
Yeah. And that's just the kind of thing where like,
I want to see them as children. No, wait, that was a bad idea.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like the idea that if people kind of like take this new movie and they go, geez, what a twist. I mean, not a twist, but what a bait and switch that they're not going to, we got 10 minutes of Luke in this and Leia was in it for 10 minutes, too. And it's all just a Han Solo story. And I'm like, I don't even care about who these people are. Then they're going to have to really think about, where they're going to market their new expanded, the expanded story stuff. It's like, well, people, we thought we could kind of spin this away from the core of the Han, Leia, Luke, Lando thing. It's like, oh no, we're going to have to go back and have them be more. Cause I feel like they're really, at first I was kind of thinking like, oh, they're just really holding on to these characters because it's like, it's the gold. They don't want to have to spend that currency until they have to. But But also part of me feels like, yeah, maybe they're kind of trying to spin the whole universe away from, the Skywalkers, the Solos, the Chewbacca's. And so they can like, oh, we don't have, even for money, just to like, well, you can't have, they can't constantly be referring back to the same 5 characters. So that's maybe what this attempt is of their, like, let's try to see, like, let's throw some stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
Right. I mean, I think it's also probably a function of, or at least it's the benefit of, only doing this for 4 issues. It's the benefit of that they don't tie their hands for something that either they or someone else might come up with a couple of years down the road where they say, well, we can't do that because we, issue 27 of Shattered Empire, this person does something else instead. That kind of caused a lot of problems eventually with the old EU stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's
that problem with like this recommitment to canon concept.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know if you can
commit. And I wonder like how long of a timeline, like how long of a horizon do they see this going, right? Like how long are they going to be making Star Wars books and comic books and everything? And I don't know. I don't even know if they know.
Right.
But what happened in the EU was you start off so you start off with like the Lando trilogy and the original Han Solo trilogy, but the modern quote unquote what really kicked off all the EU stuff was the Zahn trilogy, and so you get Luke and Han and Leia and Lando doing stuff. You focus on your big players, and then just book after book after book focuses on these big players, and then after not very many years, you kind of run out of new things to do with them. So you just go like, well, let's give them kids, I guess. And like that'll give us some new storylines. And so you have to go to that well of like the cheap sitcom conceit of like, I don't know, someone's cousin is visiting and
exactly.
Is living with them now. We're like, like I said, Lando runs a hotel now,
Exactly. It's kind of.
I just realized that was a conversation we had off air, but no, it wasn't. No, that was on there. That was on here.
Yeah, we talked about it. Lando Mysteries. Yeah. But, I don't know. And this is going to go into might go into the aftermath stuff. Mm-hmm. It's just when I get in my mind, it's like, I just feel like that the core of these characters, unless you're going to offer me something, and it really hinges on this new movie, at least for me being a fan and how I go forward being a fan of Star Wars. It's like, those, they have, Boyega and Ridley and Isaac, they have like a lot of weight on their shoulders acting wise. It's like they have to have that. Well, and the people that create these characters, it's like they have to, they're going to have to find some way to hook me. Now, I don't know if that's really what, Lucasfilm is thinking of. Maybe they're thinking like, we really need to hook a 9-year-old or,
yeah,
so
I'm sure that's probably closer to what they're thinking.
It's like, I don't need to please some 42-year-old podcaster. It's like, we've got all your money. We need to get the kids' money.
I mean, I'm sure they are aware of that. I'm going to go back on what I just said. I think they are aware of that a little bit. I mean, certainly, I think they view their core audience as the younger generation who then is going to, grow up with these movies essentially over the next 5, 6, however many years. But I think they also are probably aware that a big section of their audience is people like us, who either have podcasts or, have access to the internet where they're just going to complain about stuff they don't like. And yeah, they don't have to listen to those people too much, but, they also understand that bad word of mouth can sink this whole endeavor. And so they need to at least keep the older folks interested and engaged so that they actually decide to bring their kids to these things,
Yeah.
So and clearly we've seen that with the way that they're marketing this thing and using the original trilogy music and all the previews. And although some of that may have been because the new music hasn't been recorded yet, but I think it's to connect with that sort of initial feeling, that initial sentiment of people who saw the original trilogy and, all the harping on practical effects and everything. They're definitely like, what 9-year-old is going to care about practical effects or digital sets? That's aimed at people like us. So I think they are trying to walk that line and trying to speak to both audiences.
Yeah, especially since, they're watching Clone Wars, they're watching Rebels, and there's no division of like, it's all fake because it's all in a computer. Right. It's all been rendered. And
to them, it's all Star Wars. That's the thing too. It's not like
there's no.
They say it's like, well, I'm just gonna pretend that the sequel trilogy just never happened. And they're like, to them, it's all Star Wars.
Right. I don't. And also, there's going to be there's such a bounty of it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like the idea that, I mean, sometimes you have to take a step back and think to myself, like, okay, so we've got this movie coming out in 3.5 months, and then when is Rogue One? Is that another December release? Or is that a May release?
I wanted to say that was May, but it might have gotten pushed back.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they're filming right now, unless the special effects are all done. I know some set photos got leaked again, but it's pretty much they're still in some kind of sandy place with a bunker and palm trees. But so even a year.
December 16, 2016.
Yeah, so we're talking like a year. That's all you have to wait. It's kind of, it's like, I'm going to do one of those back in my day, but the wait from, really it was only from 80 to 83. Empire came out in May of 80. Jedi came, that was really the agony. People go like, I don't really think people were definitely looking forward to Empire, but the nice thing about the way they did it back, in the pre-home video thing, is they would release these movies constantly. So, the movie came out in 1977, May, no toys, was like, bumper stickers, T-shirts, cheaply made.
You just went and saw the movie. That's how you sort of connected with the movie, is you just saw the movie. You didn't go buy toys, you just went and saw the movie a lot.
But by the time a normal kid's interest would have waned and be like, well, Superman the Motion Picture's coming out, then they boom and get you in 1978. They get you with that, with all the toys came out, because they finally got around to making them.
Yeah. And
then all of a sudden you got all that, and then there was, the holiday special, which, people make fun of, but that was Star Wars for people. The comic, and then the comics came out, and then by the time you were kind of getting tired of that stuff, then Empire was like 6 months away. So it's that kind of thing. It was really that from Han Solo in carbonite to Luke with no hand and lost lightsabers and I'm your father, that kind of stuff. 3 years, and then there was conspicuously the
and as you've talked about, Star Wars: A New Hope is sort of like a self-contained story,
right?
Whereas Empire Strikes Back, like, that's the cliffhanger. Like, you don't know what's happening with Han Solo. You don't know, is Darth Vader really his father or not? And so, that sort of amped up, I would imagine, that kind of amped up the waiting period, the like agony of like, oh no, I don't know what's going to happen with these characters. Like, I need to see what happens. I need to know.
Yeah. And I think that really got to the boiling point where it was like, you really kind of got into the spoiler territory. I had this really weird occurrence happen in my family where we were super, my family was super jazzed about going to see Empire, so we went and saw it the first weekend. But by the time Jedi came out, it almost seemed like and Jedi wasn't playing in my town, which that's crazy, but there was a time when big movie would come out, and it might not be playing in your town.
Yeah, like, nah, we're good.
Yeah, it was like, because we had a one screen theater, in town. So, it took like it felt like 2 months, but it probably was more like 3 weeks to actually get to go to the nearest big town to go see it. So I'm sitting there, at the grocery store, and the comic book adaptation is out, and I'm just like picking it up because it's like anything Star Wars. I mean, I remember getting excited. I think I've already told this story, but there was like a thumb-sized in Starlog magazine sometime in '82, like a thumb-sized picture of the Imperial base on Endor where Vader lands his shuttle, and seeing that matte painting and like being like, that was the only. I saw that image, and I saw a picture of Luke and Vader in an elevator. That's all I saw. You know what I mean? Between 80 and when the movie, that's all. So I'm holding this thing and like having to like I'm only going to look at 3 pages. And of course, seeing the page, picking up the page of, Luke cutting off Vader's hand in the comic book and going, I can't do this. I'm going to ruin it for myself. Whereas now, kids don't know how good they got it, but that also might work against it. It's like
isn't it interesting that, and this is a whole big discussion, and I don't want to sound like an old person or even more than I already do, but it isn't interesting that something like that and stuff when I was growing up, it was the same way, right? The way that you could tell that you really loved something was like you wore that thing out, whether it was like your favorite shirt or a magazine that had pictures of, a tiny picture of Darth Vader in an elevator, right? Like, because you looked at that thing all the time and you handled it all the time, and, your baseball cards you took everywhere with you, whatever. And nowadays it's like, you like something because you keep it in pristine condition.
You never use it.
You look at it, you encase it in glass, and you don't touch it ever. You just look at it. Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, we're getting, it's close to 90 days now. It's only like 92 or 93 days, I think, until The Force Awakens. And then a year after that, we're getting Rogue One, and then 6 months after that, we're getting Episode 8. And so, my guess, it would not surprise me at least if they kind of reserve those movies to tell, the stories about the big recognizable characters, your Han Solos, your Luke Skywalkers, whatever. Keeping the movies as that kind of Skywalker saga idea, and then using the novels and the comic books and whatever else to tell either smaller stories about those characters within the original trilogy timeline like they're doing now, or, to focus on these new characters that they're developing and sort of building and sort of putting in place around the main characters. I mean, in part because, those movies have to be in development for a while. And so, what's his name? Is Colin Trevorrow, I guess, is already working sort of on Episode 9. Ideas for Episode 9, and so they can't have a situation where he starts working on it, they get the script, and then right before they start shooting, they say like, well, we just approved, or like this novel just came out that tells a different story, so you're going to have to change the backstory for this character now. Right. Because they have all of these movies lined up for the next several years, they have to sort of let the people in charge of those movies sort of have their say. And so that means then they're going to have to focus on all the characters who we don't see in those movies and maybe build some backstory, but for the most part, kind of focus on the other aspects of the rebellion or the other aspects of, how they build up the New Republic, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't know. Is Trevorrow actually writing a script for Episode 9?
No, he tweeted out a photo. I don't remember if it was on Twitter or Instagram, but he put a photo of him sitting at like a table, and there's a Lucasfilm.
Yeah, it's like a moleskin with
skin on his desk. So he was like, "Oh, getting ready for work" or something like that. So it could just be, directors usually have some kind of script input anyway. So it could be just him jotting down story ideas or visual ideas. Just things he was like, "Oh, I want to put maybe he is. Oh, I want to redesign the B-wing and put that in the movie." I assume it's just stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that supposedly Rian Johnson was signed to do he's directing 8 and doing scripts for 8 and 9, but that was just hearsay. And I mean, like I said, when they get to that point, they're going to be so kind of, all speed ahead. They're not going to be able to reorientate, how people perceive Star Wars. I mean, like I said, Episode 7, they're probably not going to mess with it too much, even though, I mean, I still heard like there's still that looming rumor that somebody had mentioned that there's going to be some revelation in this episode that's going to change our whole how we view everything that came before. But I haven't heard that again, and like I said, it was hearsay, but the guy who mentioned it has been right before about things, and at least his source, I guess.
Right.
Because I mean, I stay off of the really heavy spoiler websites. Because it's so easy for me just to move my finger and get down to areas I shouldn't. I mean, I knew, the concept of Luke's saber. I mean, that got spoiled for me pretty early on in the process, even before we started the show. But yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of. I'd really like to. And I'm probably going to bug some kid in my family at some point that's into Star Wars, like how they perceive this kind of after the movies come out. If they're into it, it's not going to make any sense if they're really into, Avengers and they don't want to talk about Star Wars. But just this idea that like, is this something that's like, when you in your mind you think a lot about it a lot, or is it just one of, I think about Avengers, I think about Minecraft, I think about whatever 2 things that are going to come out in the next 6 months that every kid is gonna be thinking about. I mean, Disney's been smart trying to create a more inclusive universe. There's definitely aside from some of your feelings about the casting for Rogue One, I think is what girls have been entered more. We're seeing a lot more color on screen. It's all good things. The cynical part of me is like, I guess it doesn't matter because if it's marketing or not, because that's representation is always good in life. So I mean, there's a cynical part of me that thinks like, oh, you're just getting people ready for some more corporate, it's like, well, now that we have people, everybody is welcome. Now I'm going to sell you something. I mean, that's
right.
I guess that's American. Right. That's American culture, though. I guess you can't really go against. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to bring you to the table, and then we're going to show you the catalog that we want you to start buying from.
It's a business. It's a company. It does stuff in order to make money.
Yeah, I guess you can't really fault them.
Yeah. Well, the ways it goes about making the money, certainly speak to what kind of company it is. But yeah, at the end of the day, it has a responsibility to its shareholders to turn a profit.
Yeah, I mean, it could be
sort of
I guess
how
you
it
could
works.
I guess you could think of it. I guess you could think it would be a lot. It could be really horrible, and then find out like, oh, gee, it's like the Vanity Fair TV host thing all over again. Where all of a sudden it's like, here's your Star Wars. It's here's
right.
It's
a dozen white dudes.
And then you find out Disney's like, yeah, we found out that persons of color don't really track well with our shareholders, and so I mean, it could be far, far worse than the concept of being like, yeah, come on in, let me sell you a T-shirt, kind of idea. So maybe it's a good time to kind of get into this. Are we going to should I talk about Uprising, or should I talk about Aftermath?
Yeah, so let's talk about Aftermath, since we're sort of leaning in that direction. So last week we had this discussion about kind of the mixed reviews that Aftermath was getting, and were we even going to read it? And I was like, well, I might read it just to read it, but I'm not going to become that invested in the books anymore, maybe potentially. And so I ended up starting to read it probably Friday or Saturday, and like I could hardly put it down. Like I finished it in about a day, maybe a day and a half. It's actually, Aftermath is actually pretty good. And I can be a little harsh when it comes to sort of writing style and the mechanics of writing and how well written some of these books are. And this one certainly has its issues, but I'm sort of willing to overlook them. I'll get to that in a minute. But so you have not read Aftermath yet?
I actually finished it last night.
Oh, excellent. So then this is my part of the review, I guess. Then like I said, I think it's actually pretty good. I like the direction that they're taking to connect Return of the Jedi with whatever The Force Awakens ends up as. Both in this and in Shattered Empire, they're sort of doing similar things, moving in similar directions. The same with Star Wars Rebels, but that's obviously setting up, moving from episode 3 to episode 4, and these are moving from episode 6 to 7. A lot was made of how the writer Chuck Wendig took this kind of like mosaic approach. And so, with all of these interludes and just sort of getting an image or pictures of what was happening around the galaxy in the wake of the second Death Star being blown up and the Emperor and Darth Vader being killed. And that's true, he does that, but I think the extent to which it acts as this kind of mosaic style is a little overblown, because there's definitely a main story and there's structure to the main story, and then there are just occasional interludes that sort of highlight, okay, well, this is what's happening on that planet, and this is what's happening on this other planet, and just to sort of show that this one story is one story of several that could be told, but like that this is actually an important story for understanding what's going to happen afterwards. And in some cases, some of those interludes I thought set up future stories and or, video games, whatever, that could potentially be really interesting. Like, there's an interlude on Jakku where someone shows up. I'm not really spoiling anything here, but he's like, oh, I came to Jakku because I was tired of war. And like the bartender's like, oh, don't worry, they'll never come to Jakku. And of course, in Battlefront, there's a Battle of Jakku, and that the aftermath of that Battle of Jakku is evident in The Force Awakens. And so it's just like that kind of little touch and was, I thought, interesting. And the storyline that they had on Tatooine was kind of interesting. I thought, and finding Mandalorian armor and whose armor is it, and who is the guy who buys this armor. That sets up some potentially interesting directions. So those are most of the parts that I liked. To get back to the writing is really uneven. Because this is, I think, a style that Wendig has apparently adopted in some of his other sort of original novels. But to me, it just comes across that he's trying too hard to impress the reader or too hard to be sort of interesting and innovative, specifically in using present tense, third person present tense the entire time, with the exception of a few times where it slips. And when it slips, it's really glaring because you're like, well, that doesn't match up with the rest of this thing. Yeah. When I guess it was it Entertainment Weekly online maybe published an excerpt a couple months ago, and now it's basically the opening of the book. That's how the book opens. That's about as bad as it gets. It gets better after that, to me at least. But you have a lot of these short sentences and one sentence paragraphs. You have some what I think are unnecessary use of parentheses throughout, like about what a character is thinking, and it's like, well, you don't need parentheses for that. You can just write the paragraph. And if you're not using quotation marks, then that means it's not something they're saying. It's something they're thinking. But I think a lot of that actually just comes down to the need for better editing. And this has been a problem that Star Wars novels have had for a while now, maybe always, is that the editing process for these maybe isn't as careful as it could be in multiple phases of the editing process. And Wendig reportedly wrote this book in less than 45 days. And it was originally supposed to come out in November, and then they pushed the release up to September. So I think maybe a more careful editing process, both in setting up, working with Wendig to set up what the story is and the structure, and then afterwards in, line editing and copy editing and editing it for rhythm and clarity and all that, like that. That's probably where I would ding this book more on, like Wendig himself. And because his writing is also, it becomes a little less noticeable to me when he's focusing on like plot or dialogue or action, like especially when he's like in a character's head and what they're thinking, like that's when his writing becomes the most annoying to me. But when he's just like, when something's happening and they're having conversation, they're moving along to like act on something, like then his sort of writing style, his sort of obvious, like, hey, look at me kind of writing style fades into the background a little more. Another thing I liked about it is that there's a mother-son relationship in this book, which I don't know that we've ever really seen much of like that multi-generational family dynamic. I mean, you have like father figures like Obi-Wan with Luke, and they had, I guess, Han and Leia had kids, and Luke and Mara Jade had kids, and so that those relationships got explored a little bit, but I think this is handled a little bit better than those were. And then also, they are pretty rare to see, and so that was kind of neat to see the multiple family members across generations working together. I have more to say, but what did you? I'll stop for now. So, what did you think, Robert?
Well, I mean, I will present the caveat that I had to read this. I'm a slow reader by nature, and I knew I was kind of under the gun because I wanted to get this done in time for the show. So I did read it I started in the audio book, and then I started.
Oh my God! Those short sentences and one sentence paragraphs must be so obnoxious in audio.
And then I sped it up because the app has you can speed it up, because I was like, it's too slow. And at the end, I found out, like, I went back to the print and finished up in the print. I mean, I was pretty disappointed in this, but also I wasn't like horribly disappointed, because I kind of went in knowing that they're not going to give you the whole enchilada in a story. But I honestly thought, it's like, they introduce Wedge. Oh, it's going to be a great Wedge story. And it really never got to be. He was a minor character in what I thought was going to be a book about him. So it's like, it's not that the story's bad, because it really isn't. There's a lot of good kind of like you said, that mother son stuff that doesn't seem to get depicted in Star Wars. But a lot of it kind of felt like, some of it felt like, especially with the Imperial stuff, felt very Zahn light. Mm-hmm. Like somebody was doing a bad impersonation of Timothy Zahn in a lot of the storytelling, maybe not the writing. Yeah.
So what Robert's referring to, for those who haven't read the book, is right. So if the Emperor and the Darth Vader are dead, the Empire has to sort of figure out what to do next, and so there's this high level meeting between essentially the four branches of the Empire. You have the military, represented by the Navy and the ground forces. You have sort of the political side with a Moff or Grand Moff, and then you have kind of the mystical, dark sidey side, represented by someone who I don't think is a Force user himself, but he was one of Palpatine's like advisors. And, kept talking about like, oh, Emperor Palpatine, always talked about the dark side being X or Y, and we just need to go back to that.
Like those weird purpley pasty faced guys that are briefly shown in Jedi. It's something people like that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
so yeah, you're right. The way those were written, it was, I see what I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I see what you mean about it being sort of someone trying to emulate sort of the way Zahn might tell that story.
And even down to like, there's an early line because Sloane, who is the she's an admiral.
She's the admiral.
Now, I'm sorry. I know this is kind of embarrassing. She's in something else, isn't she?
She first shows up in A New Dawn.
Okay, so I haven't read that.
So she first shows up in A New Dawn, and then she's also getting. There's a short story coming out in that Rise of the Empire compilation that's about her. So we've mentioned her on the show a couple times, just in terms of like, oh, here's something that came out with her or this character in it.
Well, so she says something. There's a line I think in like the second chapter, and she refers to something. This person is everything that's wrong with the Empire because they're undisciplined, they're untrained, and that is almost word for word what Admiral Palian says in the early lines, the first chapter of Heir to the Empire, where they slowly they kind of give you like they do the old Star Wars, where you always see the bad guys first and find out where, well, except for the prequels, but you get this idea that this is where the bad guys are at. Now let's go look at our good guys, and that's what they do. In Heir to the Empire, it's just the idea where everything just feels kind of watered down, and
there, and you're right. There's a twist at the very end that feels like, oh, this is sort of that Zahn trilogy, isn't it? And I'm not going to say what it is, but it's tied to that analogy that you just made.
And it's like they're going, and this is going to be a trilogy of books, and hopefully he's adjusting this style. I mean, the problem is that since they quickly show that the locus of the story is not going to be our favorites, it actually becomes, at least for me when I read it, it bothered me more when the interludes would show up, because I knew I wasn't going to get a lot of them. I mean, spoilers, there's going to be some spoilers here, but basically, I think, isn't Princess Leia seen from a distance?
There's one where with Han and Chewie, but it's like sort of they're in between things, and then they get this mission, so they're about to start this mission, and then it cuts back to the real story. And then there's one that takes place on Cloud City, but Lando's not there, but Lobot is there, and Lobot's doing something, but he's like a voice over the intercom, essentially.
Yeah, and didn't they say, and maybe because I'm consuming so much Star Wars media, was there some inference in this story that somehow Lando had built Cloud City, or was that in one of the comics?
Oh, I can't remember.
But there was I don't think he built it. I think that was the joke.
He won it in a card game.
Yeah, it was like, in Empire, where he goes, I don't know, where he Lando swindled somebody out of it, kind of idea. It's like, did he actually hire contractors?
Right.
And that's a minor squabble.
I mean, I guess in his role as administrator, he was responsible for upkeep, so maybe he did, but I don't think he was the person who first built Cloud
And I mean, also, I mean, we could go say, right, hey, no Lando. You know,
right.
Where's the Lando? You know, there's really no Leia, definitely no Luke. I mean, this was months ago when we heard it was coming out. I honestly thought, like, okay, it's gonna be their version of the Truce of Bakura, which, I mean, Truce of Bakura never really, you know, they had that weird mushy timeline where it's like, you know, Truce of Bakura was written was maybe 6-7 years after Heir to the Empire, but it was set before, and they've already tried to have that weird soft timeline where both of the Dark Empires,
and I think it was also after, and I think it was Truce of Bakura before or after the courtship of Princess Leia. I can't remember.
I want to say before. It's literally something shows up. Something, was it Wedge? Actually, I think Wedge is in that too. Some probe arrives from the deep reaches of space intended for the Emperor,
right?
And Wedge gets it and he almost loses his fingers or something. Oh yeah, he jumps, he jettisons. It's like the old trope where, you know, somebody is trying to disarm a bomb and their hand physically gets caught inside the mechanism,
right?
And somebody has to, like, you know, I mean, it's a pretty cliche. But ironically, that's kind of what happens with Wedge, that he turns his ship into a bomb and then he jettisons himself at the last second. And this idea where it's like they're just taking, it's almost like they feel like they're taking the components and like trying to rebuild stuff. And it's, and I'm not saying it's like you have to like hold Heir to the Empire or Truce of Bakura at some kind of high standard. But I will say this, like, when those books came out, I mean, at least Heir to the Empire, people were thirsty for some Star Wars. And they didn't disappoint by, you know, dwelling too long. Yeah, okay, we did have to start with Admiral Pelion. We had to start with Thrawn. But the way that the characterizing, they were done so well, you were just already in it, you know? And when after you find out where your heroes are, and then they drift off to Talon Card and Mara Jade, they added enough mystery to kind of say, where I feel like there's just not a lot of mystery. There's an overemphasis on the concept of the casualties of war, and that's kind of the thing I was talking to somebody about. It's like the problem with Star Wars is that it's like sometimes like deep emotional examination of some of these issues, it's kind of, sometimes I feel it's really above Star Wars' emotional pay grade.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Where it's like it anytime I hear somebody ruminating about, you know, the son takes off, the son is very angry. I'm sorry, what was the woman's name? I had it on the tip of my tongue.
In the aftermath?
Yeah, the rebel pilot.
Oh yeah, because now I just want to say Nora Wexley.
Nora Wexley, and her son is, you know, angry that she abandoned him for this stuff.
Yeah,
and it's such a thin. It's almost the same criticisms of, like, did you ever see Interstellar?
No.
So the Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, it's the whole, like, McConaughey has a daughter who's probably 11 or 12, and they're very close, and he takes this seemingly what he believes to be a risky yet a mission where if he does this right, he'll come back and be reunited with his daughter. Well, through some kind of comedy of errors or people being willfully lying, at one point in her character, this McConaughey's, basically feels like she's been abandoned. And this is a thing throughout the movie, because there's the concept of time, that she never lets go of this. So even later on, there's like this 30-year-old version of this girl, and she still just is pissed about having been quote abandoned. And that kind of that becomes an issue in this thing. And I know it's done to kind of goose the emotional weight of some of the later interactions that happen. But it's almost like this rumination on war. It just, again, it doesn't feel like that's a very Star Wars thing. You start getting into this emotional, and I've complained about that on the Clone Wars. where it's
right.
In my back of my head, I start saying it's like, oh, I'm getting tired of all these Star Wars. I'm getting so bored of all these Star Wars kind of idea. Where it's,
right.
I mean, I know that they're trying to create a universe, but the idea of, it's like there's certain things. It's like, spending too much time, thinking about what side you're on, and human concepts of sexuality and stuff like that. That's never been Star Wars strong suit, and I always feel that's when it starts to get out of. It's almost like the idea of Star Trek dealt with that stuff in a kind of what I said to somebody. It's like Star Trek is like a metaphor and Star Wars is like an allegory or something. I mean, it's just like, and I don't even think that really means a lot when I say that, but it's like the idea where Star Wars is like Perseus and Zeus and, the Iliad and that kind of idea where it's the story, it's the moving, it's the plot, it's the archetypes. Whereas Star Trek, because they had so much with, so many hours of television, they could examine, they could explore concepts of racism and totalitarianism and political systems much better and also it doesn't, because it's earth-based, and I always have this thing, it's like, earth-based science fiction that the human society is a factor in its creation versus Star Wars, where it's supposed to be it's so far away that our lives and our mores really isn't a factor. It's like, they don't, never hear Luke talk about World War II or something like that.
Right.
Even though I guess technically it takes place beforehand. And whenever they get into this ruminations on war and family dynamics, like I said, I feel like it starts to go out into the ether a little bit, and I start to my eyes kind of glaze over, because I feel like if I really wanted a story about the emotional resonance of a resistance, a rebellion, it's like I could get a much better story, or I could get a lot better emotion. I could get a lot better sense of the humanity of something. If I wanted to read about that, I'd read about the French resistance in World War II. Whereas in Star Wars, it's kind of like this idea where it's like they're trying to examine these grand concepts of abandonment and stuff. It just, to me, it falls flat.
Yeah.
And that coupled with...
I will say that... Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I talked enough.
Well, I was just saying, to go back to something you said a while back, is that, to compare this to, like, the original Zahn trilogy, when Zahn introduced these new characters, they were pretty... He was able to develop them in a pretty sort of complete way, right? We knew, like, who these characters were and why they were that way. And the same with a lot of the sort of authors that followed, right? When they would set up a new character, not always, and that's when they got into that's when they became less good. But, you would get these more or less fully developed characters with backstories, and you sort of understood who they were pretty quickly. But I think that may have contributed to some of the problems, not just in terms of plot with, the different levels of canon and what was contradicting what. But, if you're going to create that fully developed character, you have to give them a history. And so, those characters' histories were in part what started sort of bumping up against each other, right? When you have Mara Jade, like, oh, well, she was at Jabba's palace, and then she was here, and she was also there, and she was actually in the background of every single scene in all three of the original trilogy movies. You just didn't know it, like that kind of thing. Which, makes those individual books, so compelling to read, and so, interesting, and so, I keep coming up with worthwhile, but that's not what I mean. Whereas now I think, because they're trying to avoid that problem, at least so early, we're getting kind of more sort of broad or sketches of these characters and not necessarily like a fully established, like, who is Ray Sloan? Like, we get hints at, why Ray Sloan sort of is who she is, but, I'm sure we're going to learn more about her in works to come, right? So it feels like in some ways everything that they're putting out is just setting up, like, well, you'll learn more about this story later, but we just want to sort of set this in motion now, which we've been sort of talking about with other things as well. Which, yeah, I mean, it can make for it satisfying. That's what I was trying to think of instead of worthwhile. Right? It can make for sort of a less satisfying reading experience. And I guess, one of the reasons I thought the book was pretty good was that it was certainly better than I expected. And I came in with really, really low expectations. And I think you and I both did. But, I had like zero expectations for even, how much Wedge would be, how central Wedge would be to the plot. Like I had very low expectations. I had like zero expectations for who it was going to be about, what was going to happen. I was like, well, let's just read this book and see what it is. And so the fact that it wasn't necessarily about Wedge as much didn't bother me quite as much, because I also have this thing about Wedge where, like, yeah, I like Wedge, but why does Wedge get, so much attention? Like, yeah. Why does he get so much attention and Lando gets like 3 books and that's it? It's also, I think, a function of, like I said, I was maybe a little more forgiving with this book in terms of not just the writing style, but, some of those kind of emotional things that it reached for. Because the writing style in particular, I think, to me, registered more as a kind of like pulp, 1950s, someone submitting something to Black Mask, like that kind of style where, like, he walked down the hole and felt a coldness that, came from within rather than from the environment around it, like that kind of thing, where it had that rhythm to it. And that kind of like repetition of certain words in each clause of the sentence or in each sentence. And so, like, once I kind of sort of said, like, all right, that's sort of what I'm going to expect from this book, and I'm just going to read it that way, then any sort of expectations for what kind of emotional resonance I expected to have, I was like, well, I'm just going to read this as more like kind of like a fun, pulpy story about some characters that take place sort of adjacent to Star Wars. Within Star Wars, but like adjacent to the main Star Wars characters. And so I think that's sort of why I might have been a little more forgiving of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think the attitude has a lot to do with it. I think I might have, come in with a slightly negative, slightly. I
came in with a negative.
I read the Amazon reviews, and I kind of was like, and there were some pretty savage reviews. And also, I keep making this mistake every time, and I will admit this is a mistake, because I got my Audible account and I have all these credits, and I keep getting these books in audio form.
Credits.
And I do not enjoy Mark Thompson as a reader. He has been kind of the de facto Star Wars reader for a couple years now, and I do not understand, why he does, like, he'll add like add like a southern accent to some characters. Like I think it was either Jakku or Tatooine, whatever character, they all had like an accent like this. And when he does any person under the age of like 20, he does this really bad kid voice, and it makes you just kind of like Nora Wexley's son. I could not stand him throughout the book, and it was partly because he sounds like this. No, Mom, I'm not gonna stay here. You abandoned me. Me and my awful. Mr. Bones. Come on, Mr. Bones. That kind of thing, and you're just like, oh. I will say this, that they might need to, either, if they're going to stick with Mark Thompson, they might need to tell him to modulate his voice a little bit, because it was just like,
yeah.
It's not.
Yeah, I mean, and that character too, Temin.
I
think his name is. Like I thought he was probably one of the more uneven characters, because he's this 15-year-old kid, and he's immature in a lot of ways, but then he also kind of like built his own battle droid, and he's figured out how to outsmart this gangster that everyone else seems to be afraid of, and he's figured out how to like build all these hiding places, and he owns his own like shop where he sells, you know, stuff. And it's like, so how like mature or immature is he supposed to be? And it never really settled on the page, as it were.
Yeah, he's like and this is a weird analogy. He's like the poor man's Ezra. And they're like,
yeah. Oh yeah. No, absolutely.
Who's a character I didn't enjoy that much either. So, I mean, I don't think teenagers work well in Star Wars, but that's just my prejudice.
Yeah. Like Luke and Leia in the original trilogy is probably about as young as they probably should go.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe like Amidala, like what's her Natalie Portman as Amidala was fine.
Yeah.
In episode 1, like I didn't think she was bad in that movie. I mean, she wasn't like amazing, but she was fine. But yeah, that's probably about as young as it should go. Because in terms of the movies, then you have to deal with like performance, but then in terms of writing, I don't think people really understand how to write for characters that young. So they just end up being really inconsistent.
Yeah, and it becomes an uncomfortable reminder of the old the Mary Sue concept in this kind of fiction, which I guess now it's kind of they've got. I think they call it the Mary Sue, and then there's like the Larry Sue or something. I don't know what it's. Initially it was based on people that wrote Star Trek fan fiction that would write themselves into the story, and they were usually 15 years old, and they would be like this kind of I'm really good at this, and all the protagonists have to come to me because I'm the only person who knows how to do anything, and that kind of brings uncomfortable memories of that when you have these characters that are extremely precocious, and back to the whole. I mean, I don't think I actually illustrated my Interstellar point is that he was, this character in Interstellar, she was angry at McConaughey way beyond the shelf life of what a person would be angry about. And that seemed to be, they used it as a plot device in this book, that him being angry about having been abandoned. And they used it to kind of, goose the emotional heft of some things that they do later in the book that turn out they tend to be
oh yeah. So this is another thing I didn't like. Wendig, I don't even know if he would call it like a plot twist, but it's this like conceit that he uses twice in the book, and even the first time it's like it's such a cliche, and it just feels cheap both times. Like it feels cheap the first time he does it, and then he does it again.
It actually does it 3 times, but with a different character on the third.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
He like kills somebody,
but at least with the same character, he does it twice. Yeah, and the second time, you're like, "What?"
He effectively kills the character only to bring them back on the next page.
Right? It's like, "Oh, I just scraped my arm a little bit. I'm fine."
And you're just like, "Oh," especially
that ship had an ejector seat after all, and you're like, "What the hell?"
Yeah, and it's like you don't need to. To me, that screams of I'm not connecting with my reader, so I have to throw this in. Like it's almost like it
feels forced. It feels forced.
Yeah, he knows that he wasn't selling it, so he like added that to kind of like, well, let's see how much you care about these characters when I kill them off. Just kidding. Right. I mean, I thought the whole like. At first, I thought, well, this is a trilogy, and then I thought, really, this whole story is going to be about getting Wedge back. I was like, okay, well, I'll go with it. But then it really didn't. It wasn't that story either. But
yeah,
with the interludes, I don't know. I guess I liked it better than Lords of the Sith.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And then like some people have already been kind of like saying like, hey, this Lost Stars book is really good.
Yeah, I have heard that.
But then I pick it up and I realize like this is another book where it's our original trilogy favorites. There's nothing about them in it, so it's like, do I really want to dedicate time? And maybe I'm just, I don't know. Maybe I'm not. I don't read a ton of fiction these days.
You're a Star Wars elitist.
I'm kind of an elitist.
It's so, Luke, Leia, and Han or nothing.
Yeah, I need the at least until you explain to me why why Finn is going to be why I'm going to love him and why I'm going to they become right now it's so nebulous. It's like, I've only seen trailers. It's like, I might find, them to be, all the new characters to be incredibly annoying. And I won't, I don't want to go down that road.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that leads me to something we'll get to in a minute. But I will say, I mean, one other positive of the movie, one other positive of the book is something that you mentioned that was the whole reason we transitioned into talking about it in the first place, is that the cast of this book is really diverse, particularly with regard to gender and sexuality. So if you pick out like who actually are the main characters whose point of views we get the most often, there are probably four. So there's Nora Wexley, a bounty hunter named Jazz Samari or something like that.
Yeah.
This like former Imperial loyalty officer turned sort of, he's just working on his own. And then Ray Sloan, who we mentioned, right? So three of those characters are women, and then the Imperial loyalty officer is gay. And then in addition to that, right, so Nora Wexley has a sister who's married to a woman. And then if you want to talk about race, they don't get into race that much, except that Ray Sloan is, described as dark-skinned, which means she's black. Although, credit for that goes to John Jackson Miller and not necessarily to Wendig. But, and I think what makes them successful, like what, because people have been complaining about this too, and which I don't understand. I mean, the reason that this just means they don't like, right? I mean, it seems like they're just saying, like, I don't want, you're injecting your sexual politics into Star Wars, and I want this preserved for whatever. Well, right, that's even saying you don't want that in Star Wars is political. But I think what makes it so successful to me is that it's basically just said offhand, right? It's just a matter of fact, like, hey, I'm listing this character trait, right? Like, I'm referring to Temin's aunts, and when I refer to his aunts, I don't mean Nora has two sisters. I mean she has a sister who's married to another woman, like stuff like that. Right. Or even the Imperial loyalty officer whose name I'm blanking on because he has three names, and I don't remember.
I can't remember.
Velis, maybe, I don't know. Right, the fact that he's gay, it just like comes up in conversation, and only because a woman hits on him, sort of. Right, so he needs to tell the bounty hunter something, and he's like, hey, I need to tell you something, and she's like, okay, fine, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, yes, I'm interested in you too, like, after this is over, we'll start dating. He's like, oh, no, I'm not really into women.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, okay. And then they move on. Like, then they keep it moving. Like, it's not a big thing that Wendig tries to, like, hammer home, and he doesn't try to make it, like, showy or try to teach a lesson about tolerance or about how, women are people too, or, it's none of that. It's just, like, that's just who these characters are. He's just introducing these characters, and that's just who they are. And I think that makes it more successful, and, than if he... Because you're right in this sense that if he had tried to make a big show of it and have it like be this twist where like, oh my god, can you this guy who worked for the Empire, he was actually gay, like that would have just been such a thudding, ineffective way to get that sort of point across, or to introduce the fact that gay people in the universe, and Lords of the Sith, he tried to do it in a similar kind of offhanded way, but it came across more of like, oh my god, did you see this twist coming? Yeah. More so than it does here, and so that's why I think it works a little better here. Yeah,
I mean, it's 2015, and they have to, you have to represent if you're going to bring people in, you have to kind of represent the totality of society. Yeah. So I don't have a problem with that.
Well, and it's not even unique to like science fiction, right? How many years have people been writing stories about, gender fluid races of people on other planets and things?
Well, yeah, I was kind of talking...
And yes, I know that's controversial too. But
I was talking about this last night before with a friend of ours, because I'm not going to say, like I said, I don't have a problem with the depictions of people having different types of sexuality or whatever, and even gender. That's fine. It works in Star Wars. It's just like the depictions of sex of any type in Star Wars. I always kind of turn my head a little bit, because Lucas was never good about sex. Star Wars is relatively sexless. I mean, people don't, Luke, he got kissed by his sister, but he didn't know it was his sister, and so that was a thing. And then Star Wars is pretty chaste. I mean, Anakin was a virgin.
The biggest, like, at least in the original trilogy, like the biggest, most romantic thing that happens is the big kiss between Han and Leia in Empire Strikes Back. And then the rest of it is just like a kiss on the forehead or, things like.
It's, and it's like, it's a weird thing. It's like, even in the prequels, it's like Lucas had still not resolved his feelings about sex, almost to the point where I call it the seduction of Padme scene, where basically she kind of turns him down, and then she's in her, her hot little number in front of the fireplace. Right. That not only do they show that he's turned down, but they actually go out of their way to show him having that nightmare in bed by himself. Because if you actually remove that scene, it would, and then you cut right to the scene where he's kind of meditating on the dock the next morning. If you remove that scene of him having a nightmare, you could have honestly have intimated that they had spent the night together, that they're like, well, we can't have a relationship, but that doesn't mean we can't have tonight. I mean, that would have been that would have been a great way to flip Star Wars, kind of flip the script on it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, their characters' ages would have made that a little awkward, but
I mean, they got married. But they got married at the end.
Their characters' ages make everything awkward.
I was going to say they got married. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing where, I mean, I guess that's a American Western society concept where it's like, what is it, May-December romances are still a little bit weird in our minds.
Well,
which they shouldn't.
No, it's the fact that he was like 10 years old in episode 1. Like, that's what makes it.
But she was like 14.
Then she saw this little kid, and it was like, yeah, I'm gonna marry. Yeah, I mean, she didn't say that, but
she's 14.
At no point was she like, yeah, I knew this kid when he was 10. Maybe this is a little weird.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, see, that's the problem with Star Wars. It doesn't have, it doesn't have that emotional heft to be able to support these grand concepts of, romantic love, and it's all just very done off screen. It's like Luke and Leia are conceived, off screen, when it's like, we've seen the Clone Wars cartoon. When did this happen? They're almost never together. It would have, if he wanted to go, it could have been that whole idea of like questionable parentage and all these. I mean, he could have opened up a Pandora's box of things. Now, I don't think having, same-sex marriages and stuff like that is opening up a Pandora's box in Star Wars. All I'm saying is that the toolbox that Star Wars has provided over the year, might not be enough tools in order to do it in a satisfying, sensitive manner. Because I mean, come on, people have to, you can't just go like, oh, I'm gonna have a gay character, and then anything I'm just going to depict them this way. It's like, hey, why are all the gay characters Imperials? It always gets problematic. I'm not saying that they should go back and not do those things. I think I think it's full steam ahead, because it doesn't take away from, it doesn't even really add to the enjoyment, but it definitely doesn't take away. But yeah, it's the idea that Star Trek has had 40 some odd years, there was the idea, I've actually brought up there was an episode of The Next Gen where it dealt with Riker goes down to a society that's genderless, and basically he falls in love with a person who identifies themselves as female. And so it's kind of like they flip the script about, androgyny, and like the society shuns this person for picking a gender and say, this is what I want to be. So it's like, I just can't imagine Star Wars ever being able to go and do a story like that and have it be a satisfying one, because it doesn't, like I said, the architecture of the universe doesn't support it.
Right. That's not what it was built to do.
So, I mean, it's like, I feel like, well, if you want representation, you should, I think, being, you know, a white cis male, so it's hardly my place to say, but I think you could look at and think, you know, well, at least we're getting some kind of we're not being swept under the carpet. It's like this, if it were a situation where Star Wars was kind of like a sexy kind of thing where characters were sleeping with each other, and then when it came to the gay characters, it was like super chaste and be like, it all took place off screen, right. And then be like, hey, wait a second, if you're going to show this, then you got to show all of it. Then you can run into some problems. But like I said, Star Wars in and of itself, it still kind of bears the scars or whatever of, you know, Lucas's very kind of Disney-esque chaste thing where, right. You know, people aren't raised by their parents, they're raised by their orphans. They're, you know, Scrooge McDuck raising, right. You know, his... That, like,
the orphan fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like...
Yeah. So I want to go back to something, go back to something you said as a way to transition to the next bit, where you were talking about, you know, you kind of, in terms of, you know, whether you're going to like the new characters, your Poe Damerons, your Reys, your Finns, you know, you kind of want to wait for the movies to come out and then like decide whether you like them or whether you think they're jerks. So I keep having this dilemma because the Art of the Force Awakens book is going to be released the same day the movie comes out, and just like the soundtrack is, and we talked about the soundtrack last week, but this was news that was announced this week that the book about, you know, sort of the concept art and drawings and things for The Force Awakens, you know, it's going to be packaged as a book, which is not new. They did that for all of the other movies.
Right.
And like, I keep having this impulse to like, oh, I need to pre-order this. And then trying to pull back and it's like, well, what if I don't like the movie? Yeah. I mean, and what's tempting me is, you know, with the soundtrack, you know, that's, you know, I love the soundtracks for the original trilogy and everything, but, you know, those original books of sort of the art of Star Wars books, you know, those help sort of reinforce my early love, at least, of Star Wars, because, you know, at the time that I started to get into it, you know, there wasn't a lot. There was the original trilogy movies. This was like right before the special edition movies came out. So there was the original trilogy movies. You had a couple of books, like reference books about, you know, the guide to the Star Wars universe or whatever. But those were still geared largely, I think, towards like the role-playing game side of it. And so you had, you know, the Star Wars role RPG books and everything. But then you had like, oh, this, you know, complete guide to Star Wars with all of the characters and weapons and planets and everything. But that, you know, so many of those references were like, yeah, well, this was in a role-playing game. And like, well, what you need to know is like how powerful this character is, or like what planet they come from, or what they look like.
Right.
And then these art books sort of emerged. And I should say, right, like originally there were these sketchbooks that came out, you know, around the same time as the original trilogy. But I'm talking about in like the late 80s, early 90s, right? And so these books are kind of packaged together a lot of the Ralph McQuarrie paintings and Joe Johnston sketches and storyboards and you know, just all these early weird concepts for what Chewbacca might look like or Yoda or whatever, right? Those, I love those. And so now that another one's coming out, I'm like, oh, I could get this book and I can just like, you know, just I go back to that memory of like sitting in my bedroom on the floor, you know, just like turning page after page, like looking at these images and these drawings and everything, and like, oh, I can do that again with this new movie. But then I have to stop myself like, well, what if I don't like this new movie?
Yeah.
And now I've pre-ordered this soundtrack. I pre-ordered this book of the concept art. They're like, what if the concept art is that good?
Yeah, it's the kind of
like, what if I'm not impressed with it?
Yeah, the soundtrack to me is a done deal. I'm going to buy that. But like I said, I've been very, after the whole Force Friday thing and then thinking about like, geez, I don't know if I don't want to buy a bunch of Star Wars stuff and have it around my house and have another, you know, box of things I have to give. I opened up a box and I found out I had more stuff that I didn't even remember I had. I have a Biggs dark lighter and I had a Chewbacca with a backpack with C-3PO in it that lights up, and I also have a Jabba the Hutt from Episode 1 that's you can pour like goo in its mouth and it'll come out.
Oh yeah.
So it's still in the packaging. Wow. So I mean, It's like so I still have this stuff I didn't even know I had, and you know, I was at this bookstore at the mall the other day, and they had a small smattering of Force Awakens stuff. And one of the things that was personally my favorite as a kid was the calendars, like the 1977, 78. There's like they had some great. Unfortunately, since I was like four and a half when it came out, I did things like drew all over it with my crayons and stuff. Sure. So my old ones.
Well, you used it.
Yeah, well, I was like, there's this great shot of Chewbacca in the gatefold that I always wanted to put up as a poster, but I stupidly tried to draw Chewbacca on Chewbacca, and it looks terrible. It's when I was 4. But right. I'm looking at the calendar, and there's not a single shot from the movie in the calendar.
Right. Well, because they're trying to keep everything under wraps, which I understand. And I honestly would prefer, because I don't want to go in with any kind of like expectation.
It's this super photoshopped thing of all these characters, and you're just like, there's no context, there's no thing. So yeah, it makes me very hesitant about like, how much do I want to buy into this? I mean, I'm already committed myself to doing a podcast, but right. Yeah, somebody, that same friend that we were talking about Star Trek with, he was like, so what are you guys going to do if you hate it?
Yeah,
and I'm not ready to have that conversation.
Keep talking about the comic books, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have that whole conversation maybe at another time. But it's like, you know, I mean, if we're talking about emotional investment in the Star Wars universe, it's like I'm not as emotionally invested as I. You know, this isn't 1999 again. This isn't like the 1999 when I was, you know, that was the year I got married, and I said something. My wife's like, "Hey, let's get married in May," and I'm like, "Nah, let's not. Let's push it off a few months because Star Wars comes out. I don't want to be doing wedding stuff when Star Wars is in the theater." That's the only life concession I ever made for Star Wars, which was, I was thinking like, I don't want to be like tasting cake slices while I really want to be waiting in line to go to the Cinerama to see the Phantom Menace. So, but you know, it's like, if it's awful, it's awful. It's kind of, but I want to see some more. I think I made a comment at one point. It's like, oh, what if they just did 2 teasers and we just left it at that? Now I'm thinking, no, I need a full trailer, and I kind of need it now. It's September, you know. I kind of want it now. I don't. Yeah. It's like another podcaster, the Rebel Force Radio guy. He keeps harping on this thing. It's like, maybe he says, I don't know. I've heard some rumors that you should be watching, you know, Sunday Night Football or something next week.
Huh.
And I don't know. I haven't been able to find anybody else talking about this rumor. He thinks that there's going to be a Star Wars trailer coming on one of the football nights, but
yeah. Well, I mean, the other part of this to me is, you know, about specifically about, you know, the art of the Force Awakens is, I mean, how many sort of new, really original designs are we going to see? Because the X-Wing, they're just sort of tweaking the X-Wing from the original trilogy.
Well, they're kind of
like, okay, the wings separate.
They're tweaking McQuarrie's design, really.
Right. You're right. If they're going back to the original Quarry design, it's like, I'm just going to look at those. I mean, the little blurb on Amazon or wherever says something about like, oh, you know, this book is going to include the blue sky concept art. So we will maybe see some like really original stuff, you know, that Doug Chang just like went to town for like whatever he wanted to see. But, you know, thinking about what we've seen so far, sort of the biggest, you know, the TIE Fighter, it's basically like a photo negative of the original TIE Fighter, right? Like it's black wings or white wings with black trim instead of black wings with white trim or whatever.
Right.
You know, the X-Wing I just mentioned, you know, Rey's speeder is sort of interesting. Like, that's kind of an interesting design. So, you know, I could see, you know, however many iterations or suggestions for Rey speeder, that could be interesting. You know, there's the New Order troop transport ship or whatever. That to me looks a lot just like, there's a name for those sort of boats that the U.S. used in World War II to get troops onto the beach heads and everything. Right? They look pretty similar to those.
Yeah, the Saving Private Ryan blood buckets or whatever they call them.
Yeah, and there's a specific name for those, but I can't think of it. Right. So, but maybe we'll see a bunch of different designs for that. Kylo Ren's shuttle is sort of it's sort of a variation on the shuttles from the original trilogy, but made to look more like Star Destroyer-y, I guess.
Yeah.
My big question is whether those wings actually fold down or whether they just stay upright the whole time. So it seemed pretty tall to just stay upright the whole time. And then, the Star Destroyers, we've seen sort of an update version of the Star Destroyers, and those are just like they added a couple little things to the original design. So, it seems like we've mostly been at least privy to sort of minor tweaks and adjustments here and there. Leia's private droid that she has.
Oh man, that
PV something. That thing, that's such a weird design. Like, it's so bizarre to me. We've mentioned it before.
I feel like somebody lost a bet, and that's why.
Yeah, they had like, well, or it's like Dex from the sequel trilogy, right? If you watch one of the little webisodes or whatever about the designs for the movie, they had all of these little maquettes or these little clay sort of heads for what that character would look like, and Lucas came by. He was like, well, take the crest from that one and put it on that head, and give the little the thing from that and put it over there. And so the Leia's droid in The Force Awakens basically looks like that's what they did. They're like, all right, we'll just take the body of a protocol droid and then put that head on it instead, and make the neck longer and give it these weird kind of human-y arms. Okay, we're done. Good. Right? It was like this weird mishmash of things. And so, yeah, like I mean, I'm sure the concept artist like went to town and came up with some really interesting stuff, but how much of that is then going to end up in the movie itself?
Yeah, is
my question.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Because I mean, and that's sort of what ended up happening in some. I guess I'm worried that it would be analogous to the book of the storyboards for the sequel trilogy. So they put out around the same time they were putting out these making of books. They put out books of the storyboards for all 6 movies, one of the original trilogy, one of the sequel trilogy. And the storyline, and the storyboards for Episode 1 are pretty different from what we got on the screen. I mean, in that case, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn are just one character, or there's you don't have sort of young Obi-Wan there, and the story flows a little bit differently, and there's some different plot points, and so yeah, I guess. I don't know if I would call it a worry, but I'm curious to see if this Art of the Force Awakens book, it's going to end up sort of a similar thing where people are going to be like, yeah, there's some really cool stuff in this book, but none of it actually made it onto the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those books were always, an important part of that process. I mean, who is doing the sketches? Do we know? Is it Doug?
I don't know.
Does Doug Chiang still work for Lucasfilm?
Well, so the cover of the book is an art is a painting of that shot of Kylo Ren with his sword in kind of the snowy forest, and that it's Doug Chiang.
Okay.
So he may have just done like a dozen. He may have come in sort of like what Ralph McQuarrie did on Episode 4, which is he painted a couple of scenes, or not even actual scenes from the movie, but George Lucas said, hey, here's an idea. I have these 2 characters and they do this thing, paint a scene of that in order to help me sort of sell this movie. So, Doug Chiang may have been brought in a similar capacity where, they're like, all right, well, we just want to have a couple, a dozen or so, really nice paintings of sort of important moments, or even not even necessarily important, but just, certain moments that we like from this movie, go paint those. And then in terms of developing the other stuff, they worked with the rest of the art department. I don't know. That's a guess, but
yeah, I was looking it up while you were talking, and they just said concept artist. So it doesn't sound like he's running the shop or anything like that. Which I think he was.
I don't think so.
He was kind of the de facto guy for Lucas during those prequels, and but he does have his own studio now. So, so should I talk about this Uprising game a little bit before we wrap it up?
I guess if you want, you've only played it for like an hour, you said, or you could save it to next week.
I played it for another hour after that. I'll give you like a brief introductory. There's not a lot of story yet. I'm kind of hoping this is something that's going to be I think there's
if they're claiming that this thing is like canon and that the users will drive the storyline, then I would assume that there's some kind of story.
Well, that's the weird thing. So it started up and there was a crawl like all Star Wars games, and then then it just dumps you in. Well, you do your character creation, and then they just start sending you on these raids, and it's like I'm up to level 10. Which I don't know what the level cap on this game is, but it is very much a dungeon crawler type game where it's like they send you to a planet and then you go through a map and then you kill all the bad guys and then you flip a switch and then the level's over. Then you go back to the hub, which is a cantina. And then at a certain point, you unlock more loot. I have different guns. I have different this. And then you have like a bratty sister character that doesn't actually accompany you on any missions. She just berates you all the time.
Oh.
And then there's like that thing where you have characters that you control, but you send them off on missions that you don't. I mean, this is very standard in RPGs where you'll sometimes have characters that you don't really control. You just send them off on a mission and you never see the mission. You just get a report at the end, and it's usually all time-based. Like, this mission will take a half an hour. This mission will take 2 days. It's Dragon Age has a lot of that kind of aspect. It's the BioWare way of doing stuff. But there's only been one appearance by that Adelhard guy, the guy who's supposedly de facto. I just wonder if this whole like this idea that he's trying to control propaganda and what it's just. I think that's just a kind of a highfalutin way of them saying that this is a sandbox game. You know what I mean?
Right.
And when they say it's going to influence canon, I think they mean it only influences the canon in and of this little sandbox. I can't.
Right.
Like.
Right. Whether this system gets opened up back to the New Republic or whether it stays in Imperial control is up to the people, but beyond that there aren't any big ramifications. Yeah,
it's like Hoth is there. It's the Anoat systems. Like I haven't been able to go to Hoth yet because I think you have to be a certain level. You have to have something going on to be able to look place. But I mean, we're talking, it's literally you're running a little maze and you shoot bad guys and you get loot and you go back. It's just that kind of repetitious stuff that. It's almost like Simpsons Tapped Out, but not even as complex because you can't. There's really no crafting where you can't take 2 or 3 things together. And well, I guess there is. There's like it's all about leveling up and coins and ending a mission and then having them tell you, oh, you unlocked this, you unlocked that, and it's. I mean, I understand that they needed a mobile game, and this is definitely something that can take up a lot of time. Because, like I said, I played an hour before I emailed you, and then I went and played another hour and a half, and it was the story really never expanded. But I guess there's a multiplayer aspect to it because there was like a chat running constantly. Like you can go in and click on it and see what people are like. Everybody's like, how do you get a lightsaber? Or, I want to be Han Solo. It's just like, I don't know if it's real or if it's like people from the company are just trying to create communications. I don't think it's going to be, it's definitely not going to be the thing that's going to draw in people that don't play those kind of games to play it. I wouldn't buy an iPad to play this if that was something somebody was thinking of. I'd be much more apt to say buy a PS4 or an Xbox if you want to play.
Right.
If you want to play Star Wars, because there's going to be a lot. I think the Battlefront's going to be, much more in at least the kind of Star Wars I like to play when I'm playing a game.
Right. Well, and right. So much was made of. Or maybe not much, but recently, it was revealed that in Uprising, you can go to Hoth after the Battle of Hoth. And so you see all the wreckage and all, the downed snowspeeders. And it's this kind of world where, wampas and scavengers are kind of run amok, even more so than they used to be. And to me, like, that sounds like a really cool idea. But then to see, because of it is a mobile game, the graphics aren't, what they are on Battlefront, right? To see sort of how that's rendered, and it's sort of, top-down POV, and you can't really get a sense of the size and scope of, a downed AT-AT or a snowspeeder or whatever. Like, it just seems like a wasted opportunity is, again, too strong, but, it's something that I would rather them have done in... I can't believe I'm going to say immersive, but, a more immersive thing like Battlefront, or, in a comic book, if they had, like, to return to what I said earlier, if, Shattered Empire, they spent, these 4 episodes, damn it, I keep doing that, these 4 issues talking about, Shara Bay and Kes Dameron, and then after that, maybe 4 issues, like, all right, well, let's jump over to the Inuit system and see what's going on with Hoth all these years later. And what kind of a wasteland it is, but there are these scavengers who show up trying to, get parts from all the downed snow speeders and everything. Like, that would have been, I think, a better way to sort of introduce that idea of, like, yeah, let's go back to this planet that there was this big battle and now there's all this wreckage everywhere.
Yeah, and even the character depictions, they're just it's very cartoon. Actually, what do they call it? What were those toys we were talking about before? Before we started the show.
The Hero Mashers?
Yeah, they all look like Hero Mashers. And
right.
So
the Hero Mashers, for those of you who haven't been to a toy store lately, or like a Target or whatever, right? It's the character, but the muscles are kind of big or whatever. And then you like press a button and their arms and feet fly off because their like body explodes. They get mashed or whatever. Yeah. And they look kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's very, except for the music, that's just little stabs of John Williams and some of the sound effects. There's really nothing about this that screams Star Wars. There's a cantina, and it's the cantina looks like a Star Wars cantina, but everything else, it's like you're fighting Imperial. I fought some Imperials, but they weren't. They were like a different type of stormtrooper. Mm-hmm. And I assume these plague troopers are going to come up later, and you keep going to like the hut. It's like, I went to a hut planet, and then there was all these like statues of huts. But I don't know. I just didn't really get it's that whole idea where they're trying to tell like these weird kind of small side stories in Star Wars fiction and games now that are just kind of like, it's all about, not insurrectionists, but all about people rising up, and in the the sassy kid sister she doesn't call them Imperials, she calls them imps. Oh, right. I'm gonna shoot some imps, and you're just like, okay, I understand. They're trying to make it. They're trying to appeal to somebody by like, hey kids, play this mobile game. We use slang just like you do, but it's like, it's not like it's bad. It's like the game never crashed on me, which is always nice. It's, I think it was constructed well, but it also has very modest expansions. I mean, the load times aren't terrible. It's not hard to understand what you're supposed to be doing. So it's very linear, kind of like you're on a map and you don't have free range to do things. Whereas, like a good RPG, it's kind of open world and you get really confused. Like, but in contrast, it's like I bought the new Metal Gear Solid 5 game, which is, I'm not going to review it because I only have played a small portion, but people are saying, oh, it's like it's the best game of the next generation. And it is kind of like, it's crazy how big it is. And high concept, and the story doesn't really make sense, but it doesn't matter, and something like that wouldn't work for Star Wars, but somewhere kind of in the middle where it's like, people, I always wanted to play Galaxies, but I never had a PC that could handle it. And now that's gone. And the Old Republic doesn't look attractive to me at all. It actually looks more like this. In some respects, it kind of reminds me of this Uprising game. But
yeah,
I honestly thought it would start out with there'd be like a story at the beginning of the game, and it would set the thing. It really does kind of just throw you into it.
Yeah.
So
I guess the trailer for it or the ad for it is essentially the story.
Right.
These people see the hologram of Leia saying that the Empire is destroyed, and then these group joins up, and then you go from there. Like, that's basically, you've seen the story, and it's just in the ad rather than in the game itself.
Right. So don't buy an iPad for it, but if you have an iPad, go ahead and give it a try. It's, it'll be fun. It's like something I guess you can play it on your phone too, but I don't know, these old eyes of mine, I don't know if I'd be able to, I'd be like, ugh.
Yeah, I don't think my phone would work for that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think we're good for the week. I got to leave some stuff.
We're well covered.
We read a lot of books, and I don't know if I'm going to read any of those other books. Are you going to read any of those young adult novels?
I might give Lost Stars a chance. The others I'm not going to, because the reviews of the other, what is it called? Like the
Jedi something lightsaber.
The Leia book or the something of a Jedi or whatever. It sounds like that's like a droid goes up to Leia or Luke or something, is like, hey, how did this happen? And then he tells the story, and then that's the end. And those are never sort of my favorite. So I might give Lost Stars a chance. The ebook version of what's it called, Aftermath, I had an excerpt from Twilight Company in the back of it, and it seemed okay.
Yeah, I didn't get to that yet.
I might give it a chance. It seems like they're trying to set it up almost as like a cross between the Republic Commando series and then the Wraith Squadron books.
Okay.
In terms of like the Wraith Squadron was part of the Rogue Squadron series, but it was like it was more of the Aaron Alston stuff more than the Stackpole books.
And that was
that kind of like special forces commando unit that has a communications officer and a medical officer and someone who can impersonate a lot of people for when they need to run a scam, and
Mission Impossible.
A sniper. Yeah, basically. So it sounds like it'll be maybe a cross between that and Republic Commando, or at least that's the impression I got from this excerpt. So I'll give it a shot.
Is that something that you liked in the past? I never read any of the X-Wing ones.
Well, so the Rogue Squadron books, so the writing's pretty bad. The ones written by Alston are fine, and they range from fine to good, but the other ones are actually pretty poorly written. They're really cliched. If you ever wonder what a character is thinking, you don't have to wait very long for them to say it. Even if these two characters have a conversation and you as a reader know that there's all this subtext to this conversation, that subtext will be explicitly set out for you immediately following that conversation. Right. So it's not very, they're not, I wasn't that inspired by them, but the plots are fine and the characters are fine.
Yes, yeah.
The Alston books were definitely better written.
And that's the thing.
And those I like them well enough.
I guess that's why I run into that problem with this Aftermath. Sorry, I'm just blanking. Mm-hmm. Is that's the idea where it's like, if you're not dealing with the big dogs, why it's like, Stackpole wrote, was it I, Jedi or whatever, which was Corran Horn, which it was their attempt at having another like Jedi. It was
right, that was a character brought over from the Rogue Squadron,
and it was also written in the first person, which is like a big no for I remember picking it up and having the guy like describing himself in the mirror, and I'm like, okay, done with this. Yeah. I bought it for $1 and I threw it right back in the Goodwill pile. It's like, no thanks. Mm-hmm. I have red hair. I have a beard. It's like, nah. Right. Anyway. If you want to engage with us online, we do have many apps.
Join the conversation.
Join the conversation. Tell me why. Tell me why Star Wars should be a lot sexier, or whatever. If you have a differing opinion, I'd love to hear it. It's always good to talk about.
Yeah.
You can reach out to talkingbirdcast@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @talkingbirdcast. We are on Facebook it's facebook.com/talkingbirdpodcast. We have a set, I think it's kind of neglected the last couple of weeks because John's been pretty busy.
I've been super busy
being an adult. And so, but you know, you never know.
But especially once, I mean, this won't be for a month, but especially once Rebel starts up, we'll be having stuff posted regularly, and I'll try to post a few more things between now and then, certainly.
Yeah, just subscribe now, so you're already good. You're in the pipe for when when he gets back on the job. It's it's www.talkingbirdStarWars.tumblr.com. I always forget Tumblr's always the most problematic.
Tumblr.
You could also give us a review on iTunes, or just rate us, or tell a friend or something.
Yeah.
We're on Stitcher. I don't think Stitcher has a rating system anymore. I think they dumped all that stuff. I just kind of stopped. Yeah. I was a big proponent of Stitcher, which is the reason that we're on it. Because I was like, this is so great. And then I realized I wasn't using my podcast app right. Because I was just, everything would download and my phone would fill up. And I found out, you can just set it not to download. And so after I found that out, I'm like, I don't really need Stitcher because Stitcher has its own ads that it lays on top. And I guess you listeners don't really need to know that. Anyway, we should be back next week with more Star Wars talk and whatever. Maybe something will drop in one of these football games that Jimmy McInerney from Rebel Force Radio is saying it might. But I don't know. I don't believe it. Anyway, thanks for listening for Talking Birdcast. I have been Robert Zachary.
I'm still John Llewellyn.
And I like this. I'm going to say it again. Only you can prevent forest fires. Goodbye.